It started with a smile. Not a warm one, not the kind you give a friend or even a stranger. It was calculated, practiced. Like everything else Bernie Madoff did, he sat in his Manhattan office high above the city, the skyline behind him gleaming with all the wealth and power he claimed to possess. But beneath the tailored suit and calm demeanor was a man who had spent decades weaving the most poisonous kind of lie, a lie that looked like hope. People came to him because they trusted him. That was his real currency. Not dollars, not stocks, not hedge funds. Trust. The invisible thread that tied generations of wealth to one man's whispered promises. The year was 2006. By then, Bernie had already been running his scheme for over 20 years. And yet, he was untouchable. The SEC had glanced his way more than once, but each time, Bernie fed them the same steady answers, like a priest reciting scripture. His charm wasn't flashy. It was clinical, precise. He made people feel safe. That was the real trick. Clients didn't just invest money with Bernie. They handed him their futures, their retirements, their college funds, their lives. He had built something that resembled a kingdom. Quiet, sleek, and utterly fake. And he slept like a baby. Even now, years later, that's what haunts people the most. That he slept, soundly, deeply, while families who trusted him were slowly being dragged into the pit. While retirees unknowingly lived off money that wasn't theirs, while charities spent donations that didn't exist, while sons and daughters were promised a future that was already stolen. Bernie knew every dollar was a lie. But in the soft hum of his Park Avenue penthouse, Bernie Madoff closed his eyes and let the darkness swallow the truth. The first crack appeared in silence. Her name was Rachel Levine, a schoolteacher from Long Island. She wasn't rich, not by the usual standards, but she'd inherited some money after her father passed, just under $100,000. She was smart, cautious, but her cousin, Alan, swore by Bernie. Safe returns, always. Even during the crash in '87, he made money. Alan told her, "You don't question it. You just cash the check." And she did. Every month for 5 years, Rachel watched her statements climb. Neat, perfect little gains, never too big, never too small, like a song on loop. But something didn't feel right. She couldn't explain it. Just a weight in her gut. So she started asking questions. She called the office. She asked about the strategy, the process, the trades. The secretary, a tight-voiced woman named Eleanor, brushed her off. "Mr. Madoff is very busy, but I can assure you, your investment is performing beautifully." That was the thing. It was always too beautiful. So Rachel pulled out $20,000, just to test. It arrived promptly, no delays. She put it in a separate account. A few months later, she asked for another $20,000. Again, it came fast. She told herself she was being paranoid, that the gut feeling was just fear, that Bernie was a genius, a Wall Street wizard, but the feeling wouldn't leave. Meanwhile, Bernie was hosting a quiet dinner in the Hamptons with 3 of his wealthiest clients. They toasted champagne over seared tuna while discussing tax shelters and yacht refittings. Not a single person at that table knew they were drinking on a foundation of lies. What Bernie did was more than steal money. He stole faith. He hijacked optimism. He turned hope into a weapon. And that night, while his guests laughed and clinked glasses, Bernie excused himself, walked into his bedroom, shut the door, and exhaled. Not with guilt, but with relief. Because the more people believed, the easier it was to keep going. There was a rhythm to Bernie Madoff's days, and he clung to it like a ritual. He woke early, before the sun. The apartment was always still at that hour, resting in the hush of privilege. He'd slip into his robe, pad quietly into the kitchen, and make his own coffee. That was one of the few things he still did for himself. Everything else, his dry cleaning, his appointments, his reservations, was handled. But the coffee, bitter and black, was a reminder. He was still in control. Bernie would sit by the wide window, watching Manhattan blink awake and go through the papers. He read everything. The Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, Bloomberg, even the gossip columns. Not because he cared, but because he needed to know what people believed. In the world Bernie had created, belief was everything. If people believed in him, they wouldn't look too closely. They wouldn't ask questions. They'd smile, shake his hand, and hand over everything they had. And it worked. It always worked. But not for Rachel Levine. Something in her was shifting. Her instincts, once so quiet, now screamed. It wasn't just the phone calls. It was the silence behind them, the way the office danced around her questions. The way every answer felt polished, like it had been practiced. So she started digging. She called a friend at a small investment firm in Brooklyn, a man named Daniel Moss. They'd dated briefly in college. He was a quiet guy, sharp, always buried in numbers. When she asked him if he'd ever heard of Madoff's split-strike conversion strategy, there was a long pause on the line. "Yeah," Daniel said slowly. "That's what he says he uses, right?" "That's what the statements say." Daniel cleared his throat. "Rach, that strategy isn't secret. It's basic. It doesn't generate consistent monthly returns, and it sure as hell doesn't beat the market every single year." Rachel felt her stomach drop. "So you're saying it's not possible?" "I'm saying," Daniel replied, "if Bernie Madoff is really doing what he says he's doing, then he's rewriting the rules of finance. And nobody rewrites the rules without leaving a trace. No one's ever seen his trades, no audit trail, no independent custodian. That's not just odd, that's a giant red flag." Rachel didn't sleep that night. She stared at her ceiling, heart pounding, replaying every moment she'd felt off about Bernie's operation, every subtle deflection, every too smooth answer, and it hit her. If this was fake, if it was all fake, then it wasn't just her money on the line. It was Alan's. It was her mom's retirement. It was hundreds, maybe thousands of people. She couldn't ignore it anymore. Meanwhile, Bernie was on a yacht in Biscayne Bay, smiling at a senator's joke about Wall Street. He laughed at the right time, nodded at the right time, sipped his wine with the ease of a man who had nothing to hide. The senator leaned closer. "You ever think about writing a book? How to Win in a Bear Market? You'd sell 1 million copies." Bernie smiled. "I prefer staying quiet." "That's why they love you," the senator said. "No flash, no hype, just results." Results. The word clung to Bernie like perfume. Everyone was obsessed with his results, never how he got them. In Bernie's head, he'd long stopped seeing it as fraud. It was maintenance, a mechanism. The machine had been built and now it had to be kept running. If that meant forging statements, using new money to pay off old promises, and lying to every living soul around him, so be it. The lie had become the product. In an upscale building on the Upper East Side, David Roth, a respected accountant, sat with his wife in silence. David had introduced half of his clients to Bernie Madoff. He'd never questioned the returns. They were good, but not outrageous. In fact, that's what had made it seem legit. Bernie was consistent, boring even. But now, David was hearing whispers. A colleague had mentioned a meeting with the SEC. Off-the-record concerns, something about no trades showing up in the clearinghouses. That should have been impossible. If Bernie was executing trades through the strategy he described, there should have been records. Dozens, hundreds. And there weren't. David stared at the floor as his wife placed a gentle hand on his knee. "Did you put our money with him?" His mouth opened, closed, then opened again. "All of it," he said softly. In Bernie's world, cracks were starting to show. Not big ones, not yet. But he felt it. An employee had mentioned that one of their feeder funds was getting antsy. A European bank was requesting more documentation. A client had demanded a face-to-face meeting with Bernie himself. Unusual. Normally, the layers of people between him and investors did the shielding. The thing was, Bernie wasn't scared. He'd faced concerns before. He'd bluffed through audits, charmed regulators, even handed out fake trade records. He was so deep into the game, he didn't believe he could lose. The real fear, buried deep inside him, was something else entirely. What if he had to stop? Because stopping meant unraveling, and unraveling meant exposure, and exposure meant the end of the illusion, the power, the lifestyle, the image. Everything. At a small SEC office downtown, a low-level examiner named Megan Connors stared at her desk. In her hands was a report, a strange, obsessive 30-page document written by a private investigator named Harry Markopoulos. It was titled, "The World's Largest Hedge Fund is a Fraud." It laid out in excruciating detail how Bernie Madoff's operation was statistically impossible, how the math didn't work, how the returns were too perfect. It wasn't written like a complaint. It read like a warning. Megan had read it 3 times. Her supervisor had waved it off. "We've looked into Madoff before," he'd said. "It's a waste of time. No smoke, no fire." But Megan felt it in her gut. There was smoke. A lot of it. In Bernie's penthouse, things were oddly quiet. His wife, Ruth, was folding towels. She didn't ask about the business. She never had. Their marriage was based on ritual, routine, and a kind of selective blindness. She loved her sons. She loved their life. That was enough. She stepped into the room and looked at Bernie. "You okay?" she asked. He nodded. "Fine. Stocks took a hit today. Everyone's talking about the downturn." He gave a soft chuckle. "Let them panic. My clients never lose." She smiled, kissed him on the cheek, and walked away. And Bernie sat there, staring into nothing, his mind racing. Because he knew what she didn't. He was running out of time. The next day, Rachel called the SEC. She didn't know what she expected. Maybe a thank you, maybe some action. Instead, she was passed from department to department, polite voices, vague answers. One of them even said, "We've received similar concerns in the past." She hung up, trembling with frustration. That was when she called Daniel again. "This doesn't feel like a scam," she whispered. "It feels like a machine, a system, something huge." Daniel was silent for a moment. "It might be," he said. "But if it is, it's going to collapse. These things always do. It's just a matter of time." And in the dark, cold hours before dawn, Bernie Madoff sat in silence. The coffee was untouched. The city was asleep. And for the first time in decades, so was his confidence. He looked at the glowing numbers on the screen, the fictional account statements, the fabricated positions, the impossible balances. All of it built on air. And he couldn't stop. There were too many people, too many lies, too many layers. If he stopped now, it wouldn't just be him. It would be everyone around him, his sons, his clients, his name. And maybe deep down, some twisted part of him believed he was protecting them. That's the part that terrified him most. Because even now, Bernie Madoff believed his own lie. The air inside the office was starting to feel different. Not louder, not busier, but tense, like the quiet just before a storm breaks. At 885 3rd Avenue, the 17th floor office of Bernard L. Madoff Investment Securities still looked like any other successful Wall Street firm. Glass partitions, glossy desks, a neat row of terminals blinking with green and red numbers. But beneath the surface, things were shifting. Bernie's trusted inner circle could feel it too, even if they didn't dare say it out loud. Frank DePascali, his longtime lieutenant, had begun coming in earlier than usual. His face, once smug with confidence, now carried a hard edge. He spent hours at his desk, checking records, cross-referencing fake trades, managing the flow of new money versus payout demands. The math was getting tighter. The margin for error, razor thin. They had been living in a fantasy for decades, spinning out account statements like movie scripts, creating trades that never happened. Each month, the operation printed thousands of perfectly forged documents. They showed returns of 8 to 12%, like a metronome. Never too flashy, never suspicious, always just right. But now, the real world was bleeding in. The 2008 financial crisis was doing what no regulator had managed to do for years, starving the scam, People needed cash, investors were scared, even the ones who'd trusted Bernie for decades were calling in withdrawals, needing liquidity to stay afloat. Some asked for millions, others, entire life savings. The machine couldn't keep up, because there were no investments, no actual securities, no money. In a modest home in Florida, 71-year-old Ira Goldstein sat at his kitchen table, staring at his Madoff account statement. His hands trembled. He and his wife had retired 3 years earlier, selling their pharmacy business and trusting the proceeds, $2.4 million, to Bernie on the recommendation of a friend from synagogue. For years, the statements arrived like clockwork, showing gentle, steady gains. They'd taken a few withdrawals for travel, for their granddaughter's college, for a knee surgery. But now, something felt wrong. The news on TV was all panic. Banks collapsing, stocks crashing. Ira tried calling the Madoff office just to check in, to ask a few harmless questions. No one picked up. He tried again, then again. At that same moment, Bernie Madoff was pacing his penthouse like a hunted animal. It wasn't the volume of withdrawal requests that scared him, it was the velocity. The fund was hemorrhaging. Clients were pulling out tens of millions. His entire scheme depended on new money constantly coming in, faster than the payouts going out. And now? Nothing was coming in. New investors weren't calling. No one wanted to buy. Everyone wanted out. He stopped at the mirror, looking at himself. The silver hair, still neatly combed. The tailored shirt, crisp and clean. To the outside world, he still looked like the man, the genius, the oracle of Wall Street. But inside, he was hollow. His phone buzzed. It was his son, Mark Madoff. "Dad, we need to talk," Mark said sharply. "I just had a meeting with our lawyers. They said if the market doesn't turn around, we could be in serious trouble." Bernie's stomach twisted. "What do you mean?" he said, carefully measured. "You know what I mean," Mark replied. "There's a cash crunch. Some of our feeder funds are asking questions, hard questions. If the SEC or the FBI gets wind of anything, I'll handle it," Bernie snapped. "It's under control." Mark hesitated. "Is it?" Bernie paused. "Yes, it is." He hung up without another word. The truth was, his sons didn't know, not really. They ran a separate, legitimate arm of the firm. Bernie had kept the dirty part locked away, handled personally by him, DePascali, and a few trusted old hands. That's how he protected them. How he protected everyone. Or so he told himself. Meanwhile, at the SEC, Megan Connors was furious. Another tip had come in, an anonymous email suggesting Bernie Madoff was hiding losses and using new investors' money to pay existing ones. A classic Ponzi structure, the kind of thing regulators should have sniffed out years ago. She brought it to her superior again. "This is the third whistleblower in 2 months," she argued. "How many people have to raise red flags before we take it seriously?" Her boss rubbed his temples. "We've investigated Madoff before. He's clean. No one else has reported any issues." "That's because they're all making money. Fake money. You think a guy like him can pull returns like this during a crisis and not have a single trade recorded in any clearinghouse? It's impossible," he sighed. "I'll escalate it. But don't expect anything soon." Megan clenched her jaw. She'd seen this kind of complacency before. The bigger the name, the less anyone wanted to believe. And still, Bernie tried to maintain the illusion. He attended charity galas. He smiled for photos. He made appearances at country clubs, shaking hands with old men who called him the last honest man in finance. He took their praise like poison. Every word of admiration drove another nail into his conscience. But still, he played the part. Because in his twisted world, it was too late to tell the truth. Then came the breaking point. December 3rd, 2008. Bernie's bank account at J.P. Morgan Chase was nearly empty. Only a few $100 million left, a drop compared to what he owed. Clients were demanding over $7 billion in redemptions. There was no way to cover it. He stood in his office staring at the wall. DePascali was silent. "This is it," Bernie finally said. "The game's over." De Pascali said nothing. Bernie walked to the window, looking out over the city. "I have to tell them. My family. They deserve to know." That night, Bernie called a family meeting in his penthouse. Ruth, Mark, and Andrew Madoff sat on the couch, their faces confused. Ruth had made tea. No one touched it. Bernie stood before them like a ghost. "I need to tell you something," he began. "Something terrible." He couldn't look at them. "It's all a lie. The investment advisory business, the returns, the profits, all of it." Mark blinked. "What do you mean?" "I never invested the money, not a dime. It was all fake. A Ponzi scheme." The silence that followed was endless. Ruth dropped her cup. It shattered. Andrew rose to his feet. "You're telling us everything you built?" Bernie nodded. "Gone." Mark was shaking. "You used our names, our reputations." "I did it to protect you," Bernie said quietly. Mark's voice cracked. "You used us. You lied to us." They left the apartment without another word. Bernie stood alone in his living room, the soft tick of the grandfather clock slicing through the air like a knife. The next day, Mark and Andrew Madoff turned their father into federal authorities. And just like that, the lie died. The phone lines lit up within hours. Reporters, investors, lawyers. The media storm hit like a hurricane. By the end of the day, the name Bernie Madoff was synonymous with betrayal, greed, and the greatest financial fraud in American history. In Florida, Ira Goldstein watched the news, frozen. On the screen, a grim-faced anchor delivered the news. Former NASDAQ chairman Bernard Madoff has been arrested and charged with securities fraud, accused of operating a Ponzi scheme potentially worth $50 billion. Ira didn't speak. His wife stood in the doorway, tears streaming down her face. They weren't just broke, they were betrayed. And in a prison cell, under harsh fluorescent lights, Bernie Madoff finally slept. Not peacefully, not deeply, but for the first time in years without pretending, because the truth was out, and the mask was finally off. The phones rang without stopping, from Wall Street to Boca Raton, from Tel Aviv to Beverly Hills. The ripple of Bernie Madoff's confession spread like a disease. Millions of people were infected by it, not with symptoms of fever or pain, but with shock, shame, and an overwhelming sense of betrayal. Nobody expected it, even those who had their doubts, those who had whispered in boardrooms or raised quiet questions at dinner parties, never expected it to be this big. $50 billion, maybe more, gone. Overnight, foundations collapsed, families went broke, charities froze, pension funds halted operations, churches, schools, synagogues, entire communities had trusted Madoff to protect their futures, and he had burned them all. In a townhouse in Manhattan's Upper West Side, 82-year-old Sylvia Geller stared at her television as if it were a horror movie. She'd given Bernie her husband's life insurance payout after Harold died in '99. She trusted him. Everyone in her bridge group used Bernie. Some had been with him for decades. The returns were always so clean, so safe. She never thought to ask questions. Why would she? Now, she was down to her last checking account, and even that would be gone in 3 months if she didn't sell the apartment. She picked up the phone and dialed her daughter. "Honey," she said, voice trembling, "I think I need to move in with you." The media descended like wolves. Reporters crowded outside Madoff's home and office, pushing microphones into the faces of his lawyers, his employees, even his doorman. Every detail of his life was dissected. His tailored suits, his beach house in Montauk, his 7 million apartment, his Rolex watches, his wine collection, even the damn slippers he wore when the FBI arrested him. But nothing compared to the rage of the victims. In a conference center in Midtown, a private meeting was arranged. Victims were invited to attend, a chance to hear from Madoff's legal team and government officials. No cameras, just faces, hundreds of them. People sat in silence, stunned, holding papers in their hands. Account statements, check stubs, portfolios that now meant nothing. Faces flushed with disbelief. Tears fell. Some couldn't speak at all. And then the shouting began. "You destroyed my parents' retirement. My son's tuition. Gone, you hear me? Gone. 50 years I worked for that money, 50 years. I trusted you. You looked me in the eye and said, 'Trust me.' And I did. You liar." The officials could barely contain the fury. One woman collapsed on the floor. Another stormed out, sobbing. An elderly man stood up, held his statement in the air, and screamed, "This was my life." At the center of it all, Bernie sat in silence. He'd been released on bail, $10 million. Paid with money that ironically didn't belong to him. He wasn't in jail, not yet. He was confined to his penthouse wearing an ankle monitor, watched closely. But it wasn't the guards or the law that tormented him, it was the silence. His family wouldn't speak to him. His friends had vanished. His name, once uttered with reverence, was now poison. He sat in the dark, watching news clips of his own face on the screen. Ponzi king, monster of Wall Street, the devil in a suit. They said he'd ruined thousands of lives, but that was wrong. It wasn't thousands, it was millions. Because it wasn't just the clients, it was their kids, their employees, their vendors. The ripple was endless, a tidal wave of financial death he'd created. And now it was crashing down on everyone. Meanwhile, the investigation exploded. The FBI raided his offices. They seized hard drives, shredded documents, bank records, correspondence, everything. Investigators discovered empty file cabinets labeled trade confirmations that held nothing. Dozens of employees were questioned. Some had known, some suspected. Most were clueless. And the real question hovered like a guillotine. How had the SEC missed this for decades? At the SEC headquarters in D.C., there was panic. Internal memos surfaced. Old reports from whistleblowers like Harry Markopoulos were unearthed. Emails that had been ignored. Warnings that had been dismissed. The government had been told repeatedly that something didn't add up, but no one had listened. Why? Because it was Bernie Madoff. He had credibility. He was one of them. A former NASDAQ chairman, a respected voice on Wall Street. He played golf with senators and went to bar mitzvahs with billionaires. His clients were prestigious, his track record impeccable. How could someone so clean be so dirty? But now, even his defenders had gone silent. His wife, Ruth, was drowning. She hadn't been charged with a crime, but public opinion didn't care. Protesters gathered outside their building. Strangers spit on her in the street. She was banned from her country club. Friends stopped answering her calls. Her accounts were frozen. Her name was splashed across tabloids. The queen of the scam. One morning, she received a letter. No return address. Inside was a single note. "I hope you and your monster rot in hell." She burned it, but it didn't leave her mind. And then there were his sons. Mark and Andrew were broken. They'd turned their father in. They'd done the right thing, but it didn't matter. The media still smeared them. Madoff's bloodline, one headline read. The public assumed they had to know, that they were part of it, that they were just as corrupt, but they weren't. They'd built their own careers, they had their own families, and now they couldn't walk into a grocery store without being recognized, hated, shamed. Mark, the older son, began to unravel first. Depression consumed him. He isolated himself, tried therapy, changed apartments. Nothing helped. The betrayal ran too deep. His father hadn't just destroyed his life, he'd destroyed his identity. Andrew, the younger, tried to hold it together, for his wife, for his kids. But even he couldn't escape the shadow. Every day, someone reminded him, "You're Bernie's son." And Bernie? He still believed in the darkest part of his mind that he'd done something noble, that he was protecting people, that he was sparing them losses, giving them a smoother ride through a volatile market. It was delusion, yes, but it kept him from collapsing completely. Until the government told him they were taking everything, the houses, the boats, the jewelry, the accounts. Everything tied to him, even Ruth's engagement ring, was seized to help repay victims. And still, it wasn't enough. In a packed courtroom weeks later, Bernie appeared in front of a judge. The room was so full they had to open an overflow space with a video feed. Dozens of victims sat in the gallery, each holding their own pain like a stone. Bernie stood in his blue suit looking smaller than usual. "I operated a Ponzi scheme," he said. The words were so calm, so flat, as if he were reading a recipe. "I'm deeply sorry." But the courtroom didn't believe him. His victims didn't believe him. Because sorry couldn't fix ruined lives. It couldn't fix lost homes, canceled weddings, delayed surgeries, or college funds turned to dust. "Sorry," one man shouted from the gallery. "Won't get my wife back." Another voice. "You're a murderer." The judge pounded his gavel, but the rage was alive now. And yet, amid all the destruction, some victims weren't angry. Some were simply numb. Like Rachel Levine, the schoolteacher from Long Island. She sat in her apartment, staring at the empty wall where her TV used to be. She'd sold it last week to make rent. Her $100,000 investment with Bernie had vanished. Her cousin Alan's money too. But it wasn't the money that hurt the most. It was the shame, the realization that she'd trusted someone who looked her in the eye and lied. That was Bernie's true talent. Not finance, not math, not even deception. It was trust. He knew how to make people believe. He knew what they wanted to hear and how to say it. Not loudly, not grandly, but softly, with confidence. He didn't sell stocks. He sold safety. When the sentencing date was announced, it made international headlines. Victims wrote letters, dozens of them. Some were furious, others devastated. Some were simply exhausted. One letter from a retired firefighter said, "I ran into burning buildings for 30 years, but I couldn't protect my wife from you." Another read, "We lost everything, and I don't know how to tell my children their college dreams are over." And yet another, "You smiled at me at the synagogue, Bernie. You sat next to me. You knew my name, and you stole from me anyway." The night before sentencing, Bernie didn't sleep. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, Ruth beside him, silent. No words left. He thought about the people he'd hurt. He thought about his sons, his clients, his name, his legacy. And he wondered, was it ever real? Or had he been the lie all along? June 29th, 2009. A date branded into the lives of thousands. The federal courthouse on Pearl Street buzzed like a beehive under siege. Camera crews lined the sidewalks. Journalists spilled into the street, their microphones aimed like weapons. Police set up barriers. The victims arrived slowly, deliberately, some in silence, some gripping folders and statements, some with shaking hands. This was the day they would finally face him. Bernard Lawrence Madoff. Inside the courtroom, the temperature felt colder than usual. The wood panels gleamed. The flag stood still. The judge's bench, elevated and indifferent, stared down like a throne of judgment. Bernie sat at the defense table, a navy blue suit hanging loosely on his frame. His once confident shoulders were slouched. His hands were clasped. He didn't look at the gallery. He barely blinked. He already knew what was coming. He just didn't know how loud it would be. Before sentencing, the victims were allowed to speak. 29 of them stood up, one by one, and they didn't hold back. A woman named Ellen spoke first. She walked slowly to the front, holding a worn letter in her hand. Her husband had written it the week before he died, of a stroke. The letter was never mailed. It was addressed to Madoff. "My husband trusted you," she said, her voice steady but low. "He said you were the only one who understood how to protect our money. We lost everything. We sold our home. He died broken. And I have to live with that." She paused. "So now you'll have to live with it too." A retired Army colonel stepped up next. He had served 3 tours overseas. He'd never cried in front of his men. But now, His voice cracked. I was never afraid of battle. I was afraid of this. He held up a statement from Madoff Securities. Every dollar I saved in 38 years is fake. You gave me paper, and I gave you trust. A woman in a wheelchair, her breathing assisted by a tank, took the floor with help from her son. She didn't speak. She just held up a photograph of her husband, now deceased. He'd been one of the earliest investors, one of Bernie's personal friends. The courtroom fell quiet as her son read a letter on her behalf. You robbed us. Not just of money, of peace, of dignity, of faith. We couldn't afford his medicine in the final months, and all we had was your lies. More voices followed. A woman who had lost her family's entire charitable fund, a Holocaust survivor whose pension vanished in the fraud, a teacher who had planned to retire the year before. Every testimony added another brick to the wall of pain. Bernie didn't look at them. He kept his gaze on the desk, as if eye contact would burn him alive. But the judge? Judge Denny Chin watched every word and every tear. When the last victim sat down, a long silence filled the room, and then the judge turned to Bernie. You may speak now, he said. Bernie stood up slowly. He held the edge of the table as if the floor beneath him might vanish. I'm sorry, he began. His voice was hoarse. I know that doesn't mean much. I know it doesn't change what I've done. I hurt people. I destroyed lives. I'll live with that for the rest of my days. He paused. When I started the advisory business, I thought I could fix it. I told myself I'd make up the losses, that I'd put everything back. But I never did. And it grew. And I couldn't stop. His words trailed off. He didn't cry. He didn't beg. He just looked tired. I deserve to be punished, he said finally. And he sat back down. Judge Chin didn't waste time. He looked around the room, face unreadable. This is not just a crime of greed, he said. This is a crime of epic betrayal. His voice grew sharper. You took money from widows, from Holocaust survivors, from charities meant to serve the vulnerable. You shattered lives, and you did so while presenting yourself as a man of honor, a man of reputation. He glanced at Bernie. There is no excuse, no justification. Not even remorse can undo what has been done. Then he delivered the sentence. I hereby sentence Bernard L. Madoff to 150 years in federal prison. The room exhaled. Some clapped, some wept. One man whispered, finally. Bernie blinked. 150 years. It didn't feel real. He was 71. He wouldn't live another 20. But the number was symbolic. It was more than punishment. It was a message to the victims, to the world, to the system that let him slip through the cracks. Back in her apartment, Rachel Levine watched the announcement live on TV. She didn't cheer. She didn't cry. She just shut the television off and stood there, staring at the wall. He was going to jail. Yes. But the money? Still gone. The damage wasn't undone, and it never would be. Ira Goldstein, the retired pharmacist in Florida, read the news online. Then he folded the laptop and called his wife into the room. He's gone, he said softly. Sentenced. Life. She didn't answer. She just sat beside him, and they stared out the window. They weren't happy. They weren't angry anymore either. Just tired. But not everyone was finished with Bernie Madoff. In the months following his sentence, lawsuits began to swirl like a tornado. Irving Picard, the court-appointed trustee, began clawing back assets. His job? To recover as much as possible for the victims. Picard filed hundreds of lawsuits. He went after other hedge funds, feeder funds, individuals who had withdrawn fictitious profits, including celebrities, universities, and charities. Some had made millions off the scam without knowing it was a scam. Madoff had robbed Peter to pay Paul, and now Paul was being asked to give it back. It was messy, unfair, complicated, but it was all that was left. Bernie, now in federal custody, was shipped to Butner Federal Correctional Complex in North Carolina. He was stripped of his title, his status, his suits. He wore a beige prison uniform and was assigned inmate number 619727 or 54. He had no more office, no more view of the city, just a small bunk, a hard mattress, and the cold hum of fluorescent lights. He ate in silence. He walked the yard alone. He did not ask for favors. Some inmates admired him, others hated him, a few even threatened him. But Bernie kept to himself. He was no longer a king, just a caged man with a past too big to escape. Back in the world he'd destroyed, the pain didn't go away. Mark Madoff, his son, never recovered from the scandal. Despite cooperating with investigators, he remained a public villain in the eyes of many. Every job offer vanished. Friends avoided him. His marriage crumbled under pressure. On the second anniversary of his father's arrest, Mark took his own life. He hung himself in his Manhattan apartment, his 2-year-old son asleep in the next room. The news shattered what was left of the Madoff family. Andrew, his brother, spiraled deeper into illness. He had been battling cancer for years. After Mark's death, it came back stronger. He died in 2014. Bernie outlived both his sons, a sentence greater than prison. And Ruth, she withdrew from public life. She gave up nearly all her assets, keeping only a fraction of her original wealth. She moved into a modest rental home, living off a small allowance, cut off from society. She rarely spoke to the press. She didn't need to. Her silence said everything. Bernie Madoff lived the rest of his life behind bars. In his final years, his health declined. Kidney failure, heart disease. He filed appeals for compassionate release. He claimed he was dying, that he had months to live. The courts rejected his requests. He died in prison on April 14, 2021, at the age of 82. There was no funeral, no ceremony, no eulogy, only a note in the press. Bernard L. Madoff, orchestrator of the largest Ponzi scheme in history, dead at 82. But the damage? Still alive. People still carry the weight of what he took, not just the money, but the faith in systems, in institutions, in people. He sold trust. And when it ran dry, he walked away from a world he had burned to the ground. They thought it would end with prison. They thought that once Bernie Madoff was sentenced, once the cold iron door slammed behind him and the judge declared his 150-year punishment, some kind of peace would follow. But peace never came. Instead, what followed was the grind, the legal grind, the emotional grind, the financial grind. Because while Bernie was behind bars, the wreckage he left behind was still spreading, like a wildfire that couldn't be contained. For the victims, life didn't go back to normal. Normal was gone. A man like Madoff didn't just steal money. He stole futures. He stole retirements, homes, marriages, reputations. He stole people's ability to feel safe. And the worst part? He didn't just hurt the rich. That's the story the media liked to tell at first. That his victims were billionaires in elite institutions. That this was a scam among the wealthy, a high society tragedy. But that wasn't true. It was teachers like Rachel Levine, now working weekends at a diner to afford rent. It was small business owners who had put their exit money with Bernie, thinking they'd finally earned their break. It was charities, hospitals, and pensioners. It was immigrants. It was Holocaust survivors. It was waitresses who never dreamed they'd be invested in Wall Street, but had trusted someone who did. And now, they were starting over. Rachel sat in a tenant meeting in her Brooklyn apartment complex. A new management company had taken over, and rent was going up. She sat near the back, arms crossed, exhaustion in her face. Gone was the neat hair and the soft cardigans. Now it was ponytails and jeans and fading hope. A neighbor whispered, "Didn't you used to be a teacher?" Rachel nodded. "Still am, just not full-time." She didn't say what she wanted to say, that she was tired. That she still woke up in the middle of the night thinking about the day she saw her balance at $4.17. that the betrayal ran deeper than just the numbers. It had gutted her sense of judgment. How could she trust again? Anyone. In Florida, Ira Goldstein watered his garden. He moved to a much smaller house now, half the size of his old place. But it was quiet, and he liked the silence. After all the noise, all the press, the government forms, the screaming, the grief, it was a kind of comfort. He bent over to pull a weed when the mail truck stopped in front of his driveway. He waved. The mailman handed him a thick envelope. Ira took one look at the return address and sighed. Madoff Victim Fund. Another update, another legal statement, another reminder. He sat on his porch and opened it slowly. The letter explained, in very official language, that a small payment would be issued from recovered funds, about 16 cents on the dollar. No guarantees for more. He put the letter down. It wasn't the money, it was the insult. He would never be made whole. Behind the scenes, Irving Picard, the court-appointed trustee, worked around the clock. His office had turned into a war room. Charts, flow maps, names connected to names, dozens of lawyers, accountants, and forensic experts reviewed every transfer, every redemption. Picard wasn't just trying to clean up the mess, he was fighting Wall Street itself. He went after banks that had funneled billions into Madoff's fund without ever verifying trades. He sued feeder funds, financial firms that had sent clients to Madoff for years and taken fees while asking no questions. He pursued individuals who had withdrawn more than they'd originally invested, fictitious profits, paid using other people's money. People screamed foul. You can't sue us. We didn't know it was a Ponzi scheme. But the law was the law, and Picard's job wasn't to make people comfortable. It was to recover what he could from anyone who came out ahead, whether they knew it was a scam or not. Some settled quietly. Others fought bitterly in court. Families were torn apart, lawsuits pitted neighbor against neighbor, and slowly, painfully, billions were recovered. Over the next decade, more than 14 billion was clawed back, a number nobody thought possible. But even that wasn't enough, because the emotional damage couldn't be counted. Ellen, the widow who'd spoken at the sentencing, moved in with her daughter in New Jersey. Every morning she passed a framed picture of her husband on the hallway shelf. She talked to it sometimes, not long, just a whisper. I miss you. She had stopped blaming Bernie, not because she forgave him, but because blame didn't help anymore. It didn't pay the electric bill. It didn't bring her peace. It didn't fix the ache in her chest every time she sat down to write her grocery list and cross things out because they cost too much. She was tired of being angry, but she would never stop feeling robbed. And yet, something else began to happen too. People got stronger. They didn't move on, but they moved forward. Support groups formed across the country, former Madoff victims meeting in church basements and community centers, sharing grief, sharing survival. Rachel eventually joined one. The first time she walked in, she expected shame. Instead, she found comfort. A retired nurse hugged her. A man who'd lost everything in the scam handed her a coffee. No one judged, no one pitied. They just understood. They called themselves the survivors. They weren't rebuilding their wealth. They were rebuilding each other. Wall Street tried to wipe its hands clean. The big banks who fed Bernie billions in client money issued quiet statements, but no one ever really took full responsibility. They settled lawsuits, paid fines, moved on. But behind the scenes, the industry changed. Compliance teams grew tenfold. Audit trails became stricter. Feeder funds were forced to prove they actually knew where their clients' money was going. The SEC, humiliated by its failure to act despite repeated warnings, went through a reckoning. Heads rolled. Procedures were rewritten. Whistleblower protections were strengthened. But for many, it was too little, too late. One journalist wrote bluntly, "The lesson isn't that Madoff fooled the system. It's that the system wanted to be fooled." As for Bernie, he sat in a cell watching the years disappear. He aged rapidly. Gone were the silk shirts, the private jets, the phone calls from senators and billionaires. Now, he spent his days in the library or pacing the prison yard. He became a ghost. He received hundreds of letters, most of them full of venom. Some came from victims, others from strangers who simply hated what he represented. Unchecked greed, unchecked ego, the hollow promise of too good to be true. Bernie rarely replied. Once he wrote a short note back to a woman whose son had died by suicide after losing everything. His words were feeble, cold. "I'm sorry for your loss. I never intended to hurt anyone. It got out of control." She never read the letter. She burned it in her backyard and stood over the ashes. In the end, Bernie Madoff didn't just steal money. He destroyed something far more fragile: trust. And once that's gone, once it's truly broken, it doesn't come back whole. You rebuild it, slowly, painfully. But it's never the same. Years later, Rachel would sit in a classroom again, this time volunteering, helping high school seniors learn about personal finance. She showed them the basics: how to budget, how to save, how to read between the lines. And one day a student asked, "Have you ever been scammed?" Rachel smiled faintly. "I've been through something I hope you never have to go through." The student nodded. "You still trust people?" Rachel looked at the class, dozens of young faces, bright, curious, unscarred. She said quietly, "I trust carefully. But yes, I still trust. Because without it, the world stops working." Time passed, but the pain didn't. It didn't fade. It didn't blur. It just changed shape. Some days it was sharp, like glass in the chest, especially when another envelope from the Madoff Victim Fund arrived, detailing another partial payout that barely made a dent in what was lost. Other days, it was dull, a background ache that throbbed behind every decision, every cautious step forward. No one truly moved on. Not really, because money could be re-earned. But what Bernie Madoff stole went deeper. He'd stolen belief, the invisible glue that holds families, communities, and even entire economies together. And for that, there was no refund. The world didn't forget. Every time a new scam surfaced in the news, another fraudster caught, another Ponzi scheme exposed, Madoff's name came up again. It was inevitable. His name had become shorthand for the worst kind of betrayal. A headline might read, "Crypto Scam Echoes Madoff's Deceit," or "The New Madoff, Hedge Fund Manager Accused of 3B Fraud." Even people who didn't know finance knew that name. It was no longer a man, it was a warning. On Wall Street, change came, but slowly. Madoff had exploited a system built on arrogance and blind faith. Regulators had been complacent, seduced by his reputation. Banks had been greedy, choosing fees over scrutiny. Fund managers had turned a blind eye, desperate to keep their clients happy. After the collapse, everyone pretended to tighten up. Firms started implementing independent audits. Custodianship rules were introduced. Feeder funds were forced to disclose risk exposure. Due diligence became a buzzword overnight. But behind the scenes, the hunger was still there. The hunger for returns, the hunger for advantage. The hunger to believe that somehow, somewhere, someone had found a secret path to guaranteed success. And that's why, just years later, new scams emerged. Smaller than Madoff's, less polished, less grand, but built on the same formula: trust, silence, greed. Back in Brooklyn, Rachel Levine stood in the aisle of a grocery store, staring at a box of cereal for 2 minutes too long. She was tired. Her part-time teaching hours barely covered rent. Her weekend job at the diner left her feet swollen and her back screaming. But she was doing it. She hadn't taken a vacation in years. She didn't buy new clothes. She cooked at home. She walked instead of taking the subway when she could. And still, some days she had to decide between eggs or medicine. She pushed her cart forward and didn't buy either. That night, she opened her laptop and looked again at her old Madoff statement. She knew she shouldn't have kept it. Her therapist had suggested burning it years ago. A ritual, she'd said, a way to let go. But Rachel couldn't. She stared at the numbers again, those clean, steady returns. Every line whispered lies. Every dollar was fiction. She closed the file and sighed. And then she opened a spreadsheet labeled New Start. It had her real savings, $6,938.37. That was it. But it was hers, hard-earned, honest, not built on someone else's loss. And that meant something. Across the country, in Colorado, a man named Luis Ortega stood in front of a packed community center. He wore a blazer with fraying cuffs, and his voice was calm, but filled with a quiet fire. Luis had been a small investor in Madoff's fund through a union pension plan. He'd lost over $400,000. Gone. No recovery, no apology. But instead of drowning in anger, Luis had built something from the wreckage. Financial Recovery Alliance, a non-profit group that offered free financial education, mental health support, and legal navigation for victims of fraud. Luis didn't pretend to be an expert. He didn't wear a tie. He didn't promise miracles. He just told his story, and people listened, because it was real. Fraud doesn't just steal your money, he said to the room that night. It steals your trust in everything. Banks, people, even yourself. That's what we're here to rebuild. Not your portfolio, your power. Applause echoed across the room. It wasn't Wall Street, but it mattered. Back in Manhattan, the skyscrapers still glittered like nothing had happened. Madoff's old office was now occupied by another firm, some tech-focused hedge fund with young employees, all tight suits and loose morals. Most of them didn't remember Madoff, or if they did, they'd say, "That was before my time," as if that excused the repetition. But every once in a while, a senior manager would walk by the break room and see a group of analysts discussing a deal with no oversight, no transparency, and a little too much confidence. And they'd feel that ghost, that creeping chill, because they'd seen what happened before, and they knew it could happen again. In North Carolina, the prison where Bernie Madoff spent his final years had become just another federal facility. No monument, no memory. The inmates who had served with him had new cellmates, and the world kept turning. But in the minds of those he hurt, his name still lingered. It came up during therapy sessions. It came up in divorce courts, in estate planning, in nightmares. For some, it came up during suicide prevention calls. A man in Las Vegas had lost everything in Madoff's scheme. He'd been stable, he thought. But one day, looking at a bill he couldn't pay, he had a panic attack and called a hotline. The voice on the other end told him, "You're not alone." And for once, he believed it. Years after the scandal, a book was published titled Burned: Surviving the Madoff Inferno. It was filled with victim testimonials, not just about money lost, but about identities shattered. One woman had been a philanthropist until the scam left her penniless and humiliated. One man had been a financial advisor who lost every client and lived with crushing guilt for trusting Bernie. The book didn't offer solutions, it offered truth, unvarnished, raw human truth, and that was enough. One section quoted Ruth Madoff, who had lived her remaining years in isolation. In a rare interview, she said quietly, "I don't know if Bernie loved anyone more than himself. I think he believed he did. But I think he loved the feeling of being trusted more than the people who trusted him." She wiped her eyes, then added, "I wish I'd known who I was married to, but I didn't. And that's what I live with now." In a law school classroom in Chicago, a professor taught a course on ethics. The first lecture of the semester opened with a single slide. Bernie Madoff, what happens when no one says no? The class leaned in. They weren't just talking about crime, they were talking about culture. A culture where results mattered more than questions, where prestige silenced doubt, where too good to be true became too powerful to fail. and a student in the front row asked, "Do you think it'll happen again?" The professor gave a sad smile. "It already has, just under different names." In Brooklyn, Rachel walked home late one evening, her tote bag heavy with papers. As she passed the quiet street of brownstones, she looked up at the stars, something she hadn't done in years. It was cold, the kind of cold that made your bones ache. But she paused anyway, and for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel broken, not healed, but not broken either. She'd survived, and that counted for something. In the years after Madoff's empire collapsed, a strange new phrase became common in financial circles: Madoff-proof. It was said with both pride and anxiety. Firms boasted that their systems were Madoff-proof. Investors asked whether funds were Madoff-proof. Auditors promised their processes were Madoff-proof. It didn't mean they were immune to fraud. It meant they'd learned to be afraid. That fear, paralyzing at first, had become part of the culture. Rachel Levine heard it one night during a seminar she was helping lead for college students, part of her outreach work for a local financial literacy initiative. The panelists were young, sharp, ambitious. They spoke about smart investing, compounding interest, the danger of inflation. And then, during the Q&A, someone asked, "What's the one thing you never do with your money?" The speaker, a hedge fund junior partner, didn't even hesitate. "Trust anyone blindly. I don't care how nice they are, how consistent their returns are, or how many people they're recommended by. If you don't see the strategy, if you don't understand it, walk away. There's no such thing as magic. If it looks Madoff-proof, verify it. If you can't verify it, run." Some in the audience laughed. Others nodded grimly. Rachel just stared down at her notepad, because that wasn't how people used to talk. Back then, you invested through your uncle's friend from Temple. You picked funds based on who your neighbor used. You believed in people who had a reputation, and that's why Bernie thrived, because he looked like trust. Now, no one looked like trust. In a cafe on the Upper East Side, Ira Goldstein, once a proud business owner, now a retired man on a slim pension, sipped lukewarm coffee and scrolled through his phone. He didn't have a financial advisor anymore. He managed his money himself now, what little remained. Low-risk, index-based, no promises, no salesman, just numbers he could understand. His friends called him paranoid. He preferred the word experienced. Sometimes younger folks in his community would ask him for advice. He never told them what to buy. He told them who not to believe. Don't fall in love with the person holding your money. That's not a relationship. That's a liability. But for all the caution, something else was happening in the background, something Madoff never saw coming. A generation of skeptics was being born. Millennials and Gen Z grew up hearing about 2008, about Wall Street's greed, about the collapse. They knew the names Lehman, Enron, AIG, Madoff. But unlike their parents, they didn't dream of being part of the system. They wanted to break it, rebuild it, or walk away from it completely. In a podcast studio in San Francisco, Avery Tran, a 29-year-old financial activist, was recording her latest episode. Her voice, confident and clear, carried through the mic. Trust is dead, and that's a good thing, because what we had before wasn't trust. It was tradition, reputation, old white men patting each other on the back and calling it integrity. Madoff proved that the system protects its own, so we don't play their game anymore. We build new ones. She talked about crypto, decentralized finance, peer-to-peer lending, not because they were perfect, but because they were transparent. Your scam might still get me, she said, but at least I'll see it coming. Back in New York, a quiet memorial service was held in a synagogue for Mark Madoff, Bernie's son, who had taken his own life. It had been years since his death, but some wounds never closed. Only a few attendees came. His mother, Ruth, sat in the back. She didn't speak. She didn't cry. She just listened. People still debated whether Mark had known. Some insisted he was innocent, a victim of his father's shadow. Others believed he must have suspected. But in the end, guilt doesn't care whether you knew or not. Guilt, real or imagined, can drown you just the same. Ruth left the service early. She moved slowly through the cold, gray street, past the reporters who no longer followed her, past the stores that no longer welcomed her, to a cab she didn't own. Her wealth was gone. Her name, forever ruined. But she was still alive. Some days, she didn't understand why. Irving Picard, the court-appointed trustee, continued his work. His office had now recovered more than $14 billion, a number few thought possible when the dust first settled. But with each dollar clawed back, he faced another battle, distributing it fairly. People argued, lawsuits continued. Some victims who had taken out money were asked to return fictitious profits. Others who had lost everything had to wait years for small checks. The public thought the case was over. But for Picard and his team, it would never really be over. It was a maze of paper, names, wires, deception. Bernie had left a mess that spanned continents, and it was still unraveling. In a college economics class, a young professor wrote 4 words on the board. "What is a lie?" His students looked at him. He pointed to the name Madoff projected behind him. A Ponzi scheme is a lie wrapped in trust. A beautiful, believable, devastating lie. And it teaches us something important. The market isn't rational, it's emotional, and people would rather believe in comfort than confront reality. A student raised her hand. "How do we prevent the next Madoff?" The professor smiled, not unkindly. "We don't. We just try to be a little harder to fool." For victims like Rachel Levine, the future came slowly. She found love again, eventually, not the sweeping romance of youth, but something quieter, gentler. A man named David who didn't flinch when she told him her story. He'd lost money in the crash too, not to Madoff, but in another fund that failed. They understood each other. They didn't judge. They shared rent in a small apartment with bookshelves and tea kettles and secondhand furniture. It wasn't the life she once imagined, but it was real. And one night, as they lay in bed, David asked her something he hadn't before. "If you could go back," he said, "would you still invest with him?" Rachel didn't answer right away. Then she said, "No, but I understand why I did." David turned toward her. "You don't blame yourself anymore?" She looked at the ceiling. "I still blame myself a little, but I also blame the system, and the silence, and the way we were all taught that asking questions was rude." She took a breath. "Now I ask everything, and I teach my students to ask too." In a classroom full of seniors, Rachel gave her final lesson of the semester. She held up a mock investment report. It looked polished, official, like something straight out of Bernie Madoff's playbook. "Looks good, right?" she asked. The students nodded. She smiled. "Now tear it apart." They looked confused. "Seriously, ask me the hard questions. Find what's missing. Find the lie. If you can't find it, don't trust it." They hesitated. Then one raised a hand. "What's the strategy? How are you generating consistent returns when the market's down?" Another added, "Why aren't the trades verified independently?" A third, "Who's your custodian bank?" Rachel beamed. They were getting it. And maybe, just maybe, that meant something had changed. Time has a strange way of freezing when trust is broken. People think betrayal is just a moment, a sharp, sudden thing. But it isn't. It's a slow erosion, a drip, a whisper. A rot that starts in the gut and works its way up to your eyes until even seeing someone the wrong way makes you question everything. Years had passed since Bernie Madoff's name dominated the headlines. But for the people he affected, time didn't soften what he did. It hardened it. It fossilized it into something permanent, something heavy. And it lived not just in memory, but in culture. In a small-town bank in Oregon, a teller named Melissa processed a check for an elderly woman. The woman smiled gently and said, "Can you double-check that the funds are real?" I got scammed once. I'm not taking chances. Melissa nodded and smiled. She was used to it. Everyone was cautious now, skeptical, guarded. The words, "I trust you," had been replaced with, "Let me see the paperwork." No one took anything at face value anymore. Not after Bernie. Not after watching one man make off with billions while flashing nothing more than a calm face and a fabricated Excel sheet. In a boardroom on Wall Street, the tone had changed too. Risk officers now carried more weight. They were no longer pushed to the corner of the room or laughed off for being paranoid. They were consulted, heard, even feared. Nobody wanted another Madoff on their hands. Every quarterly report included language about transparency and regulation. Every major fund manager had a compliance champion. Every firm had an internal joke that wasn't really a joke. "We're not Madoff, I swear." Even venture capitalists and tech startups had caught the anxiety. Due diligence wasn't just a box to tick, it was a survival instinct now. But fear doesn't build trust. It only replaces one problem with another. In place of blind faith, a colder world emerged. A world where everyone assumed they were being lied to, where kindness came off as manipulation, where success was suspicious. And for people like Rachel Levine, it was a double-edged sword. She had spent years rebuilding her life, not just financially, but emotionally. She had learned to ask the hard questions, to never take shortcuts. She had built a new version of herself, one who didn't fall for charm or polish. But sometimes she missed the world before she knew better. One day, she and her partner David went to see a financial planner. They sat across the desk from a young woman with a crisp suit and bright eyes. Her office was small but professional, the shelves filled with books on portfolio theory and behavioral economics. Rachel listened carefully. The woman was articulate, thoughtful. She explained risk. She explained allocation. She didn't overpromise. But still, when the meeting ended, Rachel couldn't bring herself to shake her hand. In the elevator, David asked, "Did you like her?" "She seemed good," Rachel replied. Then she added, "But I don't know if that means anything anymore." Elsewhere, in a quiet federal office in Washington, D.C., Irving Picard prepared another report. The trustees team had recovered more than $14.5 billion at this point. It was hailed as an incredible achievement, more than anyone had believed possible after the initial collapse. But behind the celebration, Picard felt no joy. Each dollar recovered was tied to someone's humiliation. Each check cut was a reminder of the original wound. He had met hundreds of victims. He had read thousands of letters. Some were angry, some were grieving, some were simply stunned. One line from a letter he'd never forget. "My husband died believing he was leaving us a legacy. All he left was a name we can't speak in public anymore." On the West Coast, a filmmaker began work on a documentary titled The Face of Fraud. It wasn't just about Madoff, it was about what he represented. The director, Jonathan Kern, interviewed dozens of people across the country, not just financial victims, but people affected by trust collapses of all kinds, religious, political, corporate. "What's the common thread?" the interviewer asked one day on a podcast. Jonathan leaned forward. "People want to believe, and that desire, that's what the predators use. Madoff didn't steal money. He stole our need to believe in something bigger than ourselves." In a New Jersey community center, Luis Ortega, the former union worker turned financial educator, gave a seminar titled Rebuilding from Nothing. The audience was small but engaged. He talked about budget basics, safe investments, and financial red flags. But the most important part came at the end. He stepped away from the slides and said, "You might never trust again the way you used to. That's okay, you don't have to. But don't close off your heart completely. Not everyone's a liar. Some people are just trying to survive, just like you." A woman in the back wiped her eyes. Even Ruth Madoff, now nearly invisible to the public, remained a question mark in the story. Was she complicit, naive, trapped? No one truly knew. She rarely spoke to the press. She'd given up her wealth, her homes, her name. She moved through life quietly, the shadow of someone who once lived in luxury. One journalist found her living in a small Connecticut condo under a trust. He tried to ask her questions, but she said only this: "There are no right answers anymore. Just memories you don't want, and silence you can't escape." Then she closed the door. Years later, a teacher in Boston asked her students to write a paper. What is the cost of a lie? Most students quoted books or historical examples. One student, Jacob, whose grandfather had been one of Madoff's earliest victims, wrote just 3 lines. The cost of a lie is time. The cost of a lie is trust. The cost of a lie is who we could have been if we hadn't been fooled. The teacher gave him an A. Meanwhile, in a quiet New York diner where Rachel once worked weekends to survive, a new waitress sat down during her break and opened her phone. She was scrolling through a podcast. The title caught her eye: The Madoff Effect: How a Scam Changed the World. She didn't know the full story. She'd been a child when it happened, but she pressed play. As the intro music faded, a narrator said, "Before there was crypto fraud, before influencers scammed millions, before we all learned to double-check everything, we learned the name Bernie Madoff, and we haven't trusted the same way since." In that sense, maybe Madoff got what he wanted. He wanted control. He wanted worship. He wanted to be bigger than his crimes, and in a way, he was. But not how he imagined. Not as a legacy of genius, but as a scar on the American psyche. A name not remembered for brilliance, but for the brutal truth that even the most respected man in the room might be the one holding the knife. Redemption. It's a word people love to throw around in books and movies and church pews on quiet Sundays. But in the real world, it doesn't come gift-wrapped in forgiveness or closure. Redemption, if it exists at all, is a grind. It's not one act. It's not one apology. It's not saying, "I'm sorry" into a microphone with a bowed head and expensive suit. It's what happens after the world stops caring whether you live or die. It's what happens when there's no audience left. Rachel Levine no longer woke up thinking about Bernie Madoff. That was her measure of healing, not whether she had gotten her money back. She hadn't. Or whether justice had been served, a complicated yes and no. But the simple fact that some mornings she woke up thinking about nothing at all. Peace wasn't a sunrise, it was the absence of thunder. Still, the wound was there. It always would be. But she no longer picked at it. She'd stopped measuring her worth against her loss. She was building something again, small, imperfect, but hers. One Sunday morning, Rachel visited a synagogue for the first time in years. It wasn't the one Bernie Madoff had once attended. That place had changed names, changed leadership, tried to bleach his memory from the walls, but his ghost still lingered like a bad draft. This was a smaller congregation, quieter, tucked into a side street near Fort Greene. She sat in the back. She didn't wear anything fancy. No makeup, just her. The rabbi, a woman in her early 40s, spoke about scars. "We talk a lot about healing," she said, "but healing doesn't mean erasing the pain. It means learning how to live beside it. It means saying, yes, that happened, and I'm still here." That's a form of grace. Rachel closed her eyes. That day, she didn't pray for justice. She prayed for weightlessness. Just one day where she didn't feel so heavy with what she'd lost. In North Carolina, behind thick fences and cold walls, Bernie Madoff was dying. His kidneys were failing. He was on dialysis. He could barely walk. He filed a motion for compassionate release, claiming he had less than a year to live. He said he was remorseful. He said he'd served enough time. He said he didn't pose a threat. Some people debated the request. "He's an old man," they said. "Let him die at home." Others were furious. Ellen, the widow who'd lost her husband and everything they had, wrote a letter to the court. Letting him out would be a second betrayal. "I can't buy groceries without checking my balance 3 times, but he wants freedom in his final days?" He had freedom for decades, freedom paid for by my husband's savings. The judge read her letter. He read dozens like it and denied Madoff's request. Bernie died alone. April 14th, 2021, Federal Medical Center, Butner, North Carolina. No public funeral, no obituary in the family section, no gravestone bearing words of warmth. He left behind a trail of lawsuits, broken families, a grieving widow, and a hole where trust used to live. But in his final days, he wrote letters. One of them ended up in Rachel's mailbox. It was handwritten, sloppy, old-fashioned cursive. She stared at it for 3 days before opening it. It read, "To Ms. Levine, I don't expect forgiveness. I just want to acknowledge what I did. You didn't deserve it. No one did. I used people. I told myself I'd fix it, but I never did. I couldn't stop lying. That's not an excuse. It's just the truth. I hope you found a life after me. I hope it's better than the one I stole from you." It wasn't signed with love. Just Bernard Madoff. She folded the letter and slid it back into the envelope. She didn't burn it. She didn't display it. She just kept it. Because it didn't matter if it was real regret or just one more manipulation. It didn't change anything. It didn't give anything back. But somehow, it still felt like a door finally closed. Across the country, at a financial conference in Arizona, a keynote speaker wrapped up a talk on ethical investing with a story about the Madoff scandal. "We all like to think we're smarter now," she said. "We run background checks. We do audits. But let me be clear. The next Madoff won't look like the last one. The next scam will feel new. That's why the best defense isn't regulation. It's humility." The room applauded. But some people still didn't believe it. They wanted to trust again, and some did. But many more had learned to hold part of themselves back, a sliver of doubt, a question they never would have asked before, not out of bitterness, but survival. Luis Ortega, still leading his nonprofit for scam survivors, was asked by a reporter during an interview, "Do you think people like Madoff can ever be redeemed?" Luis paused, then said, "Not by us." That's the wrong question. The real question is, can we redeem the damage they caused? Can we find meaning again, community again, without pretending the pain didn't happen? That's where redemption lives now. Not in him, in us. The clip went viral, a quote printed on t-shirts and shared on survivor forums, because people weren't looking for apologies anymore. They were looking for answers. And when answers didn't come, they settled for connection. At a reunion dinner of Madoff victims, a small private gathering held annually in New York, dozens of survivors sat in folding chairs, sipping cheap wine and laughing softly. Yes, laughing. Not at what had happened, never that, but at how far they'd come since. Rachel was there, so was Ira, so was Ellen. They spoke about their grandchildren, their hobbies. The fact that they didn't feel shame anymore, that they could say, "I lost everything," and not feel like it was their fault, that they had learned something even more valuable than risk tolerance or asset diversification. They had learned how to reclaim themselves. And on one side of the room, taped to a wall, was a single photo, not of Bernie, but of a ripped-up Madoff account statement, torn and taped back together with a sticky note underneath it that read, "This paper doesn't define me," and someone had drawn a smiley face next to it. Not mocking, not bitter, just human. Redemption didn't come for Bernie, but for his victims? It came in strange, quiet ways, in new marriages, in old friends, in therapy sessions, in classrooms, in planting a garden, in saying I was scammed and not whispering it. In telling the story again and again, not because it was comfortable, but because it needed to be real. And in knowing that no matter how much was taken from them, what remained was still enough to build something better. Legacy is a tricky thing. People think it's about buildings with your name on them, about being remembered, about books written and stories told. But real legacy isn't about remembrance, it's about impact. Not who says your name when you're gone, but what people feel when they do. And when people say Bernie Madoff, what they feel, still, after all these years, isn't awe. It's the raw sting of betrayal, the cold residue of embarrassment, the bone-deep exhaustion of being lied to. That's his legacy. A man who became the face of everything that can go wrong when trust is weaponized. Years had passed since Bernie's death in prison, but the debris he left behind still floated in the bloodstream of American finance, American culture, American memory. He hadn't just ruined people, he'd reshaped them. The victims didn't return to who they were before. They couldn't. It was like being thrown out of a moving vehicle. You don't stand up afterward and dust yourself off. You limp for the rest of your life. But some chose to limp forward. Rachel Levine had learned to live with the limp. She didn't flinch anymore when she heard his name on the news. She didn't wake in the middle of the night, clawing at old memories, at old balances that used to show promise and now felt like they'd belonged to someone else. Her account statements were simple now, real, small, earned. She didn't need them to be impressive anymore, just honest. And her legacy? She was building it every day, in the classroom. On a Thursday morning, she asked her 12th grade economics students to write about one of three things. 1. A time you lost money. 2. A time you felt betrayed. 3. A time you trusted too easily. Some of them rolled their eyes, some wrote poems, some asked if it had to be real. Rachel told them the truth. Whatever you write it for the version of you 5 years from now. That night, reading their responses, she wept, not because they were sad, but because they got it. These were children born after the scandal, and yet they carried its echo. Lines like, "I believed my friend would pay me back. He didn't. Now I ask for everything in writing." Or, "My dad got laid off because his pension fund collapsed. He told me never to trust anyone in a suit." Or, "I gave my heart to someone who just wanted answers to the test." Different shapes, same ache. Legacy isn't just about what the world remembers. It's about what the next generation inherits. And this generation, they inherited caution. In Washington, D.C., a new bill had just passed quietly through Congress, buried in the folds of a larger regulatory act. It wasn't flashy, no headlines, no ceremonies, but it was important. It required any fund managing over $100 million in private capital to submit third-party transaction confirmations and make them publicly auditable. One senator called it the Madoff Clause. It had taken 2 decades to get through. Why? Because the damage wasn't just emotional, it was structural. Bernie had exposed just how fragile the architecture of finance was. A man like him didn't hack the system. He played it exactly as it was designed, and nobody stopped him because he was making the right people comfortable. Now, the rules were changing, but rules don't change hearts. At a media panel hosted in Los Angeles, a speaker posed a question to the audience. Is there such a thing as a white-collar legacy? Can a scammer leave behind anything useful? There was silence. Then a journalist responded. Madoff left us a blueprint, not for success, for awareness. He showed us exactly where the floor breaks, and people started walking differently because of it. Another panelist added, he didn't leave a legacy. He left a warning label. And still, there were people who defended him. Not many, but they existed. They said things like, he wasn't the only one doing it. He was a scapegoat. Wall Street made him. He just reflected it back. And some of that was true, but that didn't change what he did. In a cluttered office in Midtown Manhattan, Irving Picard stood over a large finalizing report. The Madoff Recovery Initiative had reached its conclusion. Nearly $15 billion recovered. More than 70% of victims had received partial restitution. Some had been made whole, many had not. Some had died waiting. He was tired, older now, slower but proud. This was his legacy, a different kind of redemption. He never pretended he could fix what Madoff broke. But he'd done everything in his power to make sure the damage didn't become permanent. He read one last letter before heading home. It said, "You didn't just give me back money, you gave me a little bit of belief in good people again." He folded it gently and wept. Meanwhile, in Florida, Ira Goldstein was having lunch with his grandson. They sat on a bench outside a kosher deli, eating pastrami and watching pigeons chase crumbs. Ira had never told the full story before, but today felt right. "Your grandma and I lost everything to a man named Bernie Madoff," he said softly. The boy blinked. "A scam?" "A big one, the biggest." "Why'd you give him your money?" "Because he smiled right," Ira said, "and because everyone else was doing it, and because I wanted to believe." His grandson was quiet for a minute, chewing. Then he said, "I think it's brave you can talk about it." Ira nodded slowly. That was the real legacy, not shame. Survival. In a therapy office in Chicago, a woman who had once sat on the board of a Madoff feeder fund spoke for the first time in years about her involvement. "I didn't know," she said. The therapist said nothing. "I didn't ask, I should have. But I didn't." She looked out the window. It wasn't just Bernie. It was me too. And for the first time, she said the words she'd been choking on for a decade. I enabled him. That's the thing about legacy. It's not just for the one who did the harm. It falls on everyone in the blast radius, the clients, the employees, the regulators, the friends who said nothing, the family who couldn't believe, the victims who stayed silent, and the world that keeps repeating it. In 2025, a film was released titled Trust the Madoff Collapse. It wasn't a documentary. It was a slow psychological drama told from three perspectives. A single mother whose parents lost everything. A hedge fund analyst who tried to report inconsistencies but was shut down. And a fictionalized Madoff character whose charm twisted into compulsion. The final scene was quiet. Just the mother sitting at her dinner table, her daughter asleep in the next room, opening a letter from the Madoff Victim Fund that said, "Final disbursement, 1,943.74 total." She stared at it, folded it, put it in a drawer, then turned off the light. The credits rolled. People asked the director what message he hoped the film would send. He said, "That a legacy can be built by lies, but remembered through the people who endured them. That pain isn't the end of the story. It's where the truth finally begins." Truth used to be a statement, a number on a screen, a handshake across a desk, a signature at the bottom of a contract. It used to be assumed, something you stepped into like a well-lit room and just expected to be there. But after Bernie Madoff, truth became a question. A fragile, shaky thing you now had to dig for, test, verify. Because once someone steals truth from you, you don't just lose money. You lose your sense of direction. You start second-guessing your own instincts, your relationships, your memory. And that, for many victims, was the cruelest theft of all. Rachel Levine sat across from a woman in her early 30s at a modest cafe in the East Village. The woman, Nadia, was writing a book on financial trauma. She'd reached out after reading one of Rachel's blog posts about surviving the Madoff collapse. Rachel didn't consider herself a writer, but the post had gone viral in survivor forums. It wasn't just about fraud. It was about trying to live again after the ground beneath you had lied. "So," Nadia asked gently, "when did you first feel like you could trust again?" Rachel stirred her coffee for a while before answering. "I didn't," she said. "I don't know if I ever fully did. I just learned how to move forward without needing it." Nadia blinked. "You moved forward without trust?" Rachel looked out the window. "I moved forward with facts, not faith, not feelings. Just what I could verify, what I could touch, what didn't change when I blinked." It wasn't bitterness that defined Rachel's voice anymore. It was clarity. There's a difference. Bitterness keeps you in the pain. Clarity accepts it happened and still builds something anyway. In a therapy group meeting in Boca Raton, 6 people sat in a circle. All of them had lost money to Madoff. Some had been with him for decades. Others, like the man in the blue polo, Armand, had only been a client for 11 months before the collapse. "I didn't just lose money," Armand said, clutching a small stone in his palm. "I lost my ability to believe in what people say. Now, when someone tells me, 'I've got you covered,' I feel sick, like something behind those words is rotten." A woman next to him, June, nodded. Her eyes were heavy with years of grief. "I feel that too," she said. "And the worst part, it's not just about finance. It's in my friendships. I'm suspicious of kindness. I think, what if this is another setup? Another soft voice trying to sneak into my life and rob me while I'm smiling?" The room fell silent, because everyone understood. Truth wasn't something you just found again. It had to be rebuilt, piece by piece, in private, painful work no one ever sees. And yet, people did rebuild. Not everyone. Some never recovered, financially, emotionally, spiritually, but many did. Quietly, imperfectly, with scars that no longer bled, but still ached when the weather changed. In Chicago, a man named Ray, once a Madoff client and now a certified financial planner, held free monthly workshops at the public library titled, "Ask First, Invest Later." His sessions weren't flashy. There were no projections, no stock tips, no jargon, just raw, real talk. He stood in front of the small group with a whiteboard behind him and a coffee in his hand. "You don't need to be an expert," he said. "You just need to ask one question over and over again until it's answered plainly. That question is, where is my money going? If they can't show you, they're hiding something." An elderly woman raised her hand. "What if it's a friend? What if they make you feel guilty for asking?" Ray smiled gently. "That's how they do it. They make you feel like the question is the betrayal. But it's not. The lie is." This, perhaps, was one of the quiet victories of the post-Madoff world. Asking became okay again. Doubt became survival. And truth, real truth, was no longer expected to arrive gift-wrapped. It was something you had to build with your own hands. In New York, Rachel continued writing. What started as blog posts had grown into a manuscript. She called it "The Weight of Paper: What Fraud Taught Me About Living Honestly." It wasn't about finance, it was about shame. The kind that crept in after the scam. The kind no check could repair. The kind that made victims feel responsible for the crime committed against them. She wrote chapters like, "The Day I Realized I Wasn't Stupid, Just Human." Silence doesn't protect you, it protects the fraud. He didn't just steal my savings, he stole my voice, and people read it. Not just Madoff victims, not just finance folks, but people who had been cheated in relationships, people betrayed by their pastors, people who had grown up believing the wrong people for too long. Because the truth about truth is this: when it breaks across your whole life. But when it begins to return, inch by inch, it shows up in unexpected places. Rachel received a letter from a woman in Oregon. It said, "I've never invested a penny, but your story helped me leave a marriage I knew was fake for years. Your words taught me that questioning someone you love isn't disloyal. It's survival." Another came from a man in Missouri. "I was conned by my business partner. I blamed myself for 3 years. You made me realize I was groomed to trust, manipulated to relax. It's not my fault." Rachel kept these letters in a folder. She called it her mirror file. Anytime she slipped back into self-blame, she opened it and remembered. Telling the truth doesn't just heal you, it invites others to do the same. Meanwhile, the world had moved on in many ways. New scams had emerged: crypto cons, fake real estate projects, charity frauds, social media investment influencers making bold promises. But each time in the comment sections, on Reddit threads, or in the mouths of TV anchors, one name still came up: Madoff. Not as a man, but as a warning. This smells like Madoff. Don't fall for another Madoff. Remember what happened last time. In this strange way, the lie he built had become a compass for future truth. And while no one thanked him, no one should, the lesson remained. Never again means nothing if you don't look closely at the again. In a quiet graveyard, unmarked, hidden, forgotten, Bernie Madoff's body lay buried under a name nobody visited. No fanfare, no mourners, just a footnote in the dirt. Some said that was justice. Others said even that was too much. But the truth? The real judgment didn't live in the grave. It lived in the lives that continued, despite him. In every woman who said, "I won't stay silent." In every man who said, "I didn't deserve this." In every person who chose to trust again, cautiously, but openly. And in every truth rebuilt not because of him, but in defiance of him. Justice is easy to believe in when it looks like a gavel slamming down, a man in handcuffs, a headline that reads, 150 years in prison. But real justice, the kind that actually matters, is slower, messier, quieter. It isn't just served, it's lived. And for the victims of Bernie Madoff, justice didn't end with a sentencing. It barely started there, because the courtroom gave them closure, but not restoration. The justice they needed was something they had to build themselves, one breath, one day, one decision at a time. Rachel Levine knew this better than anyone. She had gone to the sentencing, had sat in the room, had listened to the victim speak and to Bernie himself say he was sorry. But that moment, that gavel, it didn't change her bank balance. It didn't remove the guilt. It didn't bring back the years she'd spent questioning whether she had been stupid. Real justice came later. It came the day she forgave herself, the day she stood in front of her class and told them the truth. I lost everything to a scam. I trusted the wrong person, but I'm still here. And I'm stronger than I was before. It wasn't just about reclaiming her dignity. It was about owning the pain, so no one else could weaponize it again. That was justice. Ellen, the widow who had written the letter that helped keep Bernie behind bars until the day he died, still didn't believe in the word justice, but she believed in continuing. In memory of her late husband, she'd started a small scholarship fund for first-generation college students, just a $1,000 per student. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't public, but she wrote each recipient a personal letter. She never mentioned Madoff, never talked about what she'd lost. She focused on what they still had. The world will give you reasons to give up. Don't. Learn everything you can, and never let anyone shame you for asking questions. Each letter was a small rebellion. A quiet push back against the system that had stolen from her. Ira Goldstein, now in his late 70s, spent most of his time in his garden. He didn't attend events anymore, didn't talk to the press, didn't go to fundraisers or panels or symposiums. His justice was peace. Every time he dug his hands into the soil, every time he grew tomatoes or clipped herbs or chased off raccoons with a broom, he was reminding himself that life didn't end with a number on a page. It ended when you stopped participating in it. So he kept planting. That was justice too. For others, justice came in anger. Armand, who had lost not just his savings but his marriage and his business to the emotional fallout, joined a victim advocacy group and made it his mission to expose modern-day fraudsters. He went after crypto con men, shady investment newsletters, unlicensed wealth gurus on social media. He ran a blog called Too Good to Be True, where he dissected scams in detail, warning others with the tone of a man who had already lived through the worst of it. His tagline, "Because once was enough." For Armand, justice didn't mean peace, it meant prevention. He couldn't get his old life back, but he could make sure someone else kept theirs. In Washington, Irving Picard stood on a small stage at a legal ethics conference. He wasn't there for applause. He hated public speaking. But they'd asked him to summarize the lessons from the Madoff case 15 years after it broke. He looked out at the room, lawyers, advisors, regulators, and students too young to remember 2008. He told them what they expected, that systems failed, that red flags were ignored, that good people got hurt. But then he said something else, something heavier. You all think justice is about catching the bad guy, but real justice is about seeing the next bad guy before he gets too far. The room went still. He tapped the podium with 2 fingers. Justice isn't reactive, it's proactive. If you don't change how you look at success, how you define credibility, how you vet those in power, then the next Madoff is already halfway there. That was what haunted Picard the most, not what had already happened, but what could happen again. And it did. New frauds surfaced every year, smaller than Madoff's, less sophisticated but built on the same bones. Blind trust, unchecked power, silence disguised as loyalty. But the survivors of Madoff's crimes? They didn't go quiet. They wrote, they spoke, they warned. Rachel went on podcasts. Armand testified before Congress. Ellen's letters were shared in classrooms. Their pain became protection for strangers they'd never meet. And that was justice, too. In a university classroom in Boston, a professor handed out an assignment: write about a time justice wasn't what you expected. A student named Ava, whose grandmother had lost her life savings to Bernie Madoff, turned in a piece that read, "Justice is what you choose to carry," by Ava Rosenfeld. When I was younger, I thought justice meant the bad guy goes to jail and the good guy gets everything back. I thought it was neat, obvious, delivered by someone in a robe. Then I watched my grandma lose everything. She never got her money back, never recovered fully. But every Friday she would bake challah, set her table, and invite neighbors over who had nowhere else to go, even when she had almost nothing. She told me once, "I'll never feel okay again, but I can still make sure someone else does." That's when I learned. Justice isn't always about making things even. Sometimes it's about making sure the damage doesn't spread. Justice is what you choose to carry and what you choose not to pass on. Her professor gave it an A, then cried in his office because he'd lost a brother to a financial scam, too. That's the part people don't talk about enough. Justice doesn't always wear a badge. It doesn't always live in prison walls. Sometimes it's a father walking his daughter to school after losing his retirement. Sometimes it's a woman who gets up and teaches others how to ask better questions. Sometimes it's simply a survivor choosing to smile again. Justice is a choice, every day, to not let what broke you define you, to not become what hurt you, to keep living anyway. As the years passed, the Madoff scandal became a textbook case. It was taught in law schools, cited in financial training, replayed in documentaries. But for the people who lived through it, it was never just a case. It was a fracture, a shift, a war they didn't sign up for, but refused to lose. They didn't just want revenge. They wanted meaning. They wanted to say, "This happened, it hurt, it broke me, but I'm still here, and I'm still good." That was their justice. Resilience doesn't announce itself. Doesn't show up like a fire truck or crash through the doors like a miracle. It comes quietly, through the simple act of continuing, breathing through panic, waking up when you'd rather stay numb, choosing again and again to exist after your world has been stripped bare. And for the victims of Bernie Madoff, resilience was never loud. It was private, personal, earned. It didn't need applause. It needed meaning. Years had passed. The scandal was no longer trending. Reporters had moved on. The headlines now belonged to new tragedies, new scandals, new lies. But in the aftermath, something remarkable began to happen. The people who once sat in silence, gripped by shame, began to lead. Not because they wanted power, but because they had something more important than titles: lived experience. Rachel Levine stood at the podium of a modest conference in Albany. The sign on the stage read, "Financial Literacy for Survivors of Fraud and Abuse." It wasn't a packed room, maybe 30 people, a few college students, some retirees, a couple of non-profit workers and therapists. But every seat was filled by someone who understood what it felt like to be lied to by someone you trusted. Rachel wasn't there as a victim anymore. She was there as a mentor. "I'm not a financial expert," she began, "and I'm definitely not someone with a success story in the traditional sense. I didn't bounce back and make millions. I didn't sue and win. I didn't rebuild a fortune." She paused, her voice steady. "I rebuilt myself." She talked about the difference between surface trust and real trust. About how we're taught to believe confidence equals competence, that charisma means credibility, that reputation is a kind of currency, and how Bernie Madoff proved that all of that is nonsense. He was good at looking honest, she said, and we were too afraid to question that, because questioning makes people uncomfortable. But you know what I've learned? She stepped out from behind the podium. Discomfort is where truth lives. If something makes you squirm, don't run from it. Lean in. That's where the cracks show, and cracks matter. That's how the light gets in. The room was silent. Then someone started clapping. Then another. Then the whole room stood up. Back in Brooklyn, her blog had grown into a full website, fraud-proof, reclaiming yourself after financial betrayal. What started as therapy had turned into a community, not a forum for revenge or bitterness, but for recovery. It had sections like what to ask before investing a dime, how to talk to family after being scammed, why your shame isn't yours to carry. People from all over the country wrote in. A teacher in Texas, a grandmother in Nevada, a divorcee in Toronto who lost her savings to a fake crypto fund. The stories were different, the ache was the same. And Rachel replied to every message, not with advice, but with something more powerful: recognition. In Florida, Ira Goldstein no longer called himself retired. He called himself a teacher, not officially. But every Thursday, he met with a group of local seniors in a community center to talk about safe investing, digital fraud, and emotional recovery. He used humor. "Don't fall for someone who looks like me," he joked one day, pointing to his loafers and tucked-in shirt. "That's the exact kind of guy that got me scammed." Laughter broke the ice, but behind his smile was a kind of earned fire. He was no longer afraid of being seen as a fool. He knew now that silence was how fraudsters win. So he told his story again and again, because every time he did, someone else opened up, and someone else realized they weren't alone. Ellen had started writing letters again. Not to politicians this time, but to people. Every week she wrote one handwritten note to someone she found through the Madoff Victim Fund or Rachel's site. Just a few lines. "I know the shame. I know the fear. I know the silence. You're still worthy. You're still allowed to trust yourself. You're still here, and that matters more than you know." Some wrote back, some didn't, but the act itself was a form of healing. Her words became seeds. She never expected to see what grew, but she planted anyway. And then there was Armand. He was no longer angry. He was focused. He ran workshops now in high schools. The program was called Spot the Red Flag. He taught teenagers how to see manipulation in real time, how to recognize financial grooming, how to spot the difference between generosity and coercion. He used real case studies, real numbers, real pain. Some students squirmed. That was good. He told them, "You'll be targeted in your life. Not maybe, not possibly, definitely. And when it happens, I want you to remember me, this old man who got tricked by a billionaire. And I want you to say, 'Not this time.'" They did. And some emailed him years later, thanking him for being the first adult who didn't tell them just to be polite. One day, Rachel received an email that stopped her breath. It was from a woman named Caitlin Madoff, not a direct relative, but a niece by marriage. The last name still haunted her. The email read, "I wasn't part of what happened. I was a kid when it all exploded, but I've grown up with that name. Being asked every time I fill out a form or introduce myself, are you related? Your writing helped me understand the pain behind that question. And now, I want to help too. I'm studying social work. I want to help people recover from trauma, financial or otherwise. I hope that's okay." Rachel stared at the message for a long time, then wrote back, "Helping others is how we reclaim what was taken. You don't carry his sins, you carry the chance to do better. And that's what matters." The world hadn't become scam-free. New frauds appeared like clockwork. New names, new headlines. New people waking up one day and realizing their life savings had been fiction. But now, there were more hands reaching out. More voices saying, "I've been there. You're not alone." More survivors standing in the light and telling their story before someone else got caught in the dark. That was resilience. That was resistance. And that was the beginning of something bigger than justice. It was the beginning of healing a culture. Rachel's book was finally published. It wasn't a bestseller. It didn't get her on talk shows, but one week, she walked into her classroom and found a note on her desk. Scrawled in teenage handwriting, it read, "I read your book. My mom got scammed last year by a fake debt relief guy. She cried for months. She blamed herself. I told her about you. She smiled for the first time in weeks. Thank you for being brave." Rachel folded the note, slipped it into her purse, and wiped her eyes before class began. Because that was it. That was the whole point. Resilience isn't loud. It doesn't always look like rebuilding empires or reclaiming fortunes. Sometimes it's just telling the truth and letting someone else breathe easier because of it. Closure doesn't arrive with a bang. It doesn't come in a court ruling. It doesn't walk through the door wearing a government badge or a check with a recovery amount printed on it. Closure is softer than people expect. It's not justice. It's not resolution. It's acceptance. And acceptance comes quietly when you stop trying to rewrite what happened and start living in spite of it. Rachel Levine was sitting on a park bench in Prospect Park, watching a boy fly a kite with his father. It was a warm spring day, the kind where the breeze feels like it's washing something old out of you. She didn't think about Bernie Madoff much anymore. Not with anger, not with regret, not even with pain, just with a kind of detached awareness, like a story you read once, underlined in parts, and then closed the book and shelved it. There was a time she'd thought closure would feel like triumph. But now, she knew better. It felt like quiet. She'd stopped asking, "Why me?" Not because she found the answer, but because she stopped needing one. She no longer needed to analyze how she'd fallen into it, how the system failed, or whether she should have seen the red flags. That story had been told, and retold, and bled dry. What mattered now was the after, the life she had built in the ruins, the students she taught, the women she mentored, the tiny community she'd helped grow from the wreckage. If that wasn't closure, what else could be? Meanwhile, across the country in a modest retirement community in Arizona, Ellen sat on her porch in the early morning light. A bluebird landed on the railing beside her. She smiled, not because it was beautiful, but because she let herself notice it. There had been years when nothing caught her attention, when every day was survival, every hour a reminder of what she'd lost, her husband, her security, her sense of safety. But today, she felt present. That, to her, was closure. Not the refund checks she received every few months from the Madoff Victim Fund, not the legal documents, not the obituaries, just the fact that she could sit in silence and not ache. She picked up a pen and added a line to the letter she'd been working on. "I forgive the world for not warning me sooner. I forgive myself for believing." I forgive. Not because they deserve it, but because I do. Not everyone got there. Armand, the once fiery activist, still wrestled with it. Some mornings he still woke with rage clawing in his chest, not just at Bernie, but at the people who enabled him. The banks, the funds, the regulators, they got to go on with their lives. He lost his. He tried meditation, tried group therapy, tried forgiveness. But for some people, closure doesn't mean peace. It means purpose. And his purpose was to make sure no one else had to go through what he did. His latest post on Too Good to Be True had reached nearly 300,000 readers. It was a deep dive into a newly uncovered real estate Ponzi scheme that had preyed on Spanish-speaking immigrants. He exposed it, got it into the news, helped connect victims with legal aid, raised over $80,000 in donations for a recovery fund. He didn't feel healed when it was over, but he felt useful. Sometimes, that's the best kind of closure a person can get. And then there were those who found closure in letting go completely. Ruth Madoff, once the quiet wife of the most notorious man on Wall Street, had disappeared from public view entirely. No interviews, no statements, no memoirs. But someone had spotted her in a small town in Maine, living in a modest apartment near the coast. Gray hair, simple clothes, walking her dog, going to the local library. She volunteered once a week at a thrift store. She never used her last name. When asked by a curious neighbor if she was that Ruth, she'd simply said, "I used to be someone else. I'm not her anymore." And that was all. Maybe for her that was enough, maybe not. But even silence can be a form of closure. In Manhattan, the offices once used by Bernard L. Madoff Investment Securities had long since been gutted and repurposed. A startup now occupied the space, open concept, beanbags, neon signs about innovation and disruption. None of them knew the history. And that's how time works. It doesn't ask for permission to move on, but in the minds of those who remember, the building still holds ghosts. Ira Goldstein, now a quiet figure in local finance education, was giving a talk at a community center when a young man asked him, "Do you think it's possible to fully move on from something like that?" Ira smiled, leaned back in his chair, and said, "You don't move on, you move with. The pain doesn't leave. You just get stronger. And one day, you realize it's walking beside you instead of dragging behind you." The young man nodded slowly. "That sounds sad." Ira chuckled. "It's not. It's real. And real is better than perfect." Rachel, reflecting on that same idea, wrote an article titled, "Closure Isn't Clean, but It's Enough." She described how she'd once waited for a magic moment, a symbolic act that would erase the stain of being duped. But it never came. Because life didn't come with erasers. It came with layers. And sometimes the wound stayed, but the meaning around it changed. In the article, she wrote, "At some point, I stopped asking for what I lost to be returned, and I started asking how to use what was left. And that's where I found peace, not in justice, but in redefinition." There was, however, one final moment that caught many by surprise. A letter, not from Bernie, he was long gone, but from a former Madoff employee who had worked in the so-called back office where fake trades were fabricated for decades. He'd never been charged with a crime. He was never identified in any lawsuits, but in his letter, sent anonymously to a survivors support group, he confessed to having known something was wrong, not the whole picture, but enough. "I didn't speak up, I didn't ask questions. I kept my head down and cashed my checks. I told myself I wasn't involved. But silence is a form of involvement. To everyone who suffered, know that your pain is not invisible. I see it, I saw it, and I'm sorry. I can't undo it, but I will never forget it. No name, no return address, just those words." Rachel read it at a survivors meeting. Nobody spoke afterward, but the silence felt different this time. Not like shame, but like acknowledgement. Closure isn't about what you get. It's about what you decide to carry and what you leave behind. And in the end, that was the quiet truth the Madoff survivors learned to live with. They didn't get all their money back. They didn't get their time back. They didn't erase the betrayal. They didn't fix the system. But they found their way through. And what they built on the other side wasn't just survival. It was something more powerful. It was wisdom. It was community. It was a refusal to stay broken. And maybe, just maybe, that's what closure really is. In the end, what survives a storm isn't the tallest tree. It's the deepest roots. And when the storm is betrayal, not by one man, but by a system that allowed him to thrive, the survivors don't just emerge stronger. They emerge wiser. Bernie Madoff is gone. But the people he hurt, the ones he tried to reduce to numbers, liabilities, names on spreadsheets, they're still here, not just surviving, living. It was a cloudy afternoon when Rachel Levine stood in front of her old bank in Manhattan, the one that once mailed her perfectly forged Madoff account statements. She hadn't been there in years. There was no reason to come back. But something pulled her, not for revenge, not for drama, for closure. She stood quietly on the sidewalk, watching people rush by. New faces, new jobs, new shoes, new crises. She was invisible here now, and that was okay. She wasn't the woman who had once lost $98,000 and part of her soul. She was someone rebuilt, a teacher, a writer, a quiet warrior. Inside her purse was the manuscript of her second book, this one titled, We Still Stand, Stories from the Aftermath of Fraud. It wasn't about Madoff, not directly. It was about what came after. Far away in a small rented room in Maine, Ruth Madoff stared at the ocean. She hadn't said Bernie's name aloud in years. The few people who knew her history never brought it up. That was the unspoken deal. She was allowed to disappear, as long as she stayed silent. She kept her part of the bargain. But sometimes, when the wind came off the sea and the gulls cried like ghosts, she'd remember the apartment in the city, the empire he built, the nights he came home late smelling like power and deceit, and she would whisper one line, I should have known. But she didn't, and maybe she couldn't, and maybe that was part of it all. Ira Goldstein's health was fading. Time, relentless and unsentimental, had come to collect its dues. His son, Michael, visited every weekend. They would sit on the porch, playing chess, drinking coffee, and talking about things Ira never used to discuss. Feelings, forgiveness, legacy. You ever think it was your fall? Michael asked once. Ira looked at him, surprised. No, he said, then paused. I thought I did. But now? No, I was deceived. And that's not the same as being dumb. Michael nodded. I tell my kids your story, he said quietly. Ira chuckled. As a warning? No, as proof, Michael replied, that even when you lose everything, you can still teach others how to protect themselves. Ira didn't cry, but something in his chest eased. Ellen had moved into assisted living. The house had become too big, too quiet. Her knees didn't like stairs anymore, but every Friday, she still baked. Not for guests now, for the staff, for the nurses, for the other residents who had no family. Her challah became famous on the floor. She'd walk through the hallway with her walker, a tin of warm bread resting in the basket, and people would stop her just to say thank you. She didn't talk much about Madoff these days, but once, during a visit from a local high school history class, a girl asked her if she had any advice about recovering from loss. Ellen didn't hesitate. Stay soft. Even when the world makes you hard, that's how you win. And then there was Armand. He died suddenly, heart failure, age 74. His funeral was small, but over 1,000 people attended the live stream. Former victims, advocates, journalists, young people who had read his blog and been spared scams because of it. They didn't say goodbye to a bitter man. They said goodbye to a man who refused to stay silent, even when his own voice was cracking. On his gravestone, his family engraved a single quote he used often. Truth is protection. Speak it before someone else can't. Luis Ortega, the first victim who had spoken publicly, who had faced cameras when everyone else hid, became a public speaker in retirement. He didn't talk about Madoff anymore. He talked about systems, about empathy, about how shame isolates and silence kills. He traveled to universities, churches, town halls. At one talk in Michigan, a man stood up and asked, "How do you know you've fully healed?" Luis smiled. "You don't," he said. "You just realize one day that the wound stopped making your choices for you." The crowd went quiet. Then someone clapped. Then another. Then the whole room stood. In Washington, the SEC offices had a framed quote outside one of their auditoriums. A plaque installed a decade after Madoff's sentencing. It read, "It wasn't just one man's crime. It was everyone's silence. We must always listen for the quiet lies." No one ever admitted who suggested the quote, but it stayed, as a reminder, as a scar, as a vow. Back in Brooklyn, Rachel's book was finally out in the world. She was invited to a local NPR station for a short interview. The host asked her, near the end, if you could say one last thing to Bernie Madoff, if somehow he could hear you, what would it be? Rachel sat quietly for a moment, then looked into the mic and said, "You didn't get to keep my story." Silence. Then the host said, "Thank you." And the interview ended. Months later, at a quiet reading in a library tucked between two bodegas in Queens, a woman stood up after Rachel's reading and said, "I lost my dad to a different scam. I blamed myself for years, but your words, they made me feel like maybe I'm not the broken one." Rachel smiled gently. "You're not," she said. "You're just someone who's still standing, and that counts for everything." So in the end, what did Bernie Madoff leave behind? Not just ruined bank accounts, not just lawsuits, not just headlines. He left behind a question, a challenge, an uncomfortable, necessary conversation about power, greed, and the fragility of trust. And in answering that question, his victims became something more than survivors. They became guides for all of us. They reminded the world that trust is not weakness. Asking questions is not rude. Silence is not protection. And survival, in the face of betrayal, is a kind of revolution. And what Madoff built was a house of mirrors. What they built afterward was something real, painful, flawed, resilient, and still standing.